Algebra and Fractions. This lesson concerns linear equations with fractions involved in the coefficient and in the constants. I'm assuming that you are already familiar with the content of the fraction lessons in the arithmetic and fraction module. If you haven't seen those lessons, I'd strongly recommend go back and watch those lessons carefully. That will help you make much more sense of everything we're doing here. Here I will simply review a couple key fraction properties. Fraction fact number 1, as you may remember, the product of any fraction and its reciprocal is 1. Now that turns out to be strategically very important because it means that if a variable is multiplied by a fraction, we can undo this by multiplying by the fraction's reciprocal. So it gives us an immediate strategy that's quite valuable. Fraction fact number 2 is if we have the fraction a times b over c, we can rearrange the multiplication in any order. We can write this as a times the fraction b over c, or b times the fraction a over c. As long as the same things are always being multiplied and the same things are always being divided, the order doesn't matter. This means we can think of a variable in the numerator of a fraction as a variable times a fraction coefficient. So 3x over 5, that's just 3/5, the coefficient 3/5 times x. So those are two very important facts to keep in mind. Suppose we have this very simple equation. Take a minute to solve this. So the first thing I'll say is that people see fraction equals fraction and their immediate quick draw reflex is, oh, we have to cross multiply. And cross multiplying would actually not be the swiftest idea here. Yes, you could get to the answer kind of the long way by cross multiplying, but I would not recommend it. Because what we have here really is just a fraction coefficient times x. And of course the way we want to undo that is multiply by the reciprocal. So we multiply by the reciprocal, immediately we have x by itself. We multiply those fractions and get the answer for x. So it's a much more direct way to get to the answer. This equation simply involves multiplication. Things get a bit trickier when addition or subtraction of fractions is involved. Take a minute to pause the video and work on this. Okay, let's talk about this. Here we will begin by clearing the fractions. What do I mean by clearing the fractions? When addition or subtraction is involved, one easy way to clear fractions is to multiply by the least common multiple of all the denominators. Here the denominators are 6, 3, and 2, and so the least common multiple is 6. Here we will multiply every term by 6. So we multiply every term by 6. In the first term, the 6 is canceled, so we're just left with 7x. In the second term, the 3 cancels with the 6, so we just get a factor of 2 times the 2 in the denominator, which gives us 4. And in the 13 halves, when we multiply by 6, the 2's cancel. 6 divided by 2 is 3, so it's just 13 times 3, which is 39. Well, once we have this linear equation, then of course we subtract 4, we divide by 7, and we get x equals 5. Another example. Pause the video and try to solve this on your own. Okay, so here the least common multiple of all the denominators is 12. So I'm going to multiply every term by 12. That simplifies to this. Then of course we subtract 4x from both sides, we subtract 15 from both sides, and we divide by 2. To get x equals 3/2, and that's the answer. Here's another practice question. Here the least common multiple is 6, so we're going to multiply everything by 6. And we'll subtract 3x from both sides. We'd rather subtract in a way that will give us a positive. That's why we subtracted the 3x rather than the 8x. So we subtract the 3x from both sides, we subtract the 6 from both sides, and then we divide. Now, back to expressions for a moment. So that was equations. We were solving for x. Now we're going to think a little about expressions again, what we've been doing in the previous set of lessons. Another fraction-related skill you may need on the test is simplifying a complex fraction. A complex fraction is a big fraction with smaller fractions nested in its numerator and denominator. So for example, this is a complex fraction. The big fraction has a numerator and denominator. Inside that numerator and inside that denominator, we have smaller fractions. So we have fractions within fractions. To simplify a complex fraction, we use a strategy remarkably similar to the one we use for equations. Just as we can multiply both sides of an equation by the same number, so we can multiply both the numerator and the denominator of a fraction by the same number. To simplify a complex fraction, we multiply the numerator and denominator of the big fraction by the least common multiple of all the denominators of the little fractions. So for example, here, those little denominators are 2, 4, 3, and 2. And the least common multiple of the little denominators is 12. So we're going to multiply the big fraction by 12 over 12, which means that the entire numerator gets multiplied by 12 and the entire denominator gets multiplied by 12. And then when we cancel, we get to this, and we can't cancel anything else. We're done with canceling at this point. The only way we could cancel something else is if there were a common factor we could factor out of the numerator and a common factor we could factor out of the denominator, and they were the same. But there's no common factor between the numerator and the denominator, so this is as simple as it gets. We can even use the same technique to simplify a complex fraction composed solely of numbers with no variables at all. So suppose we have to simplify this fraction. Well, least common multiple is 18, so we'll multiply numerator and denominator by 18. Simplifies to this. We perform the addition, 14 over 21, which simplifies to 2/3. Here's a practice problem. I've even tossed in a quadratic here. Simplify this completely. Pause the video and then we'll talk about this. So first we'll multiply by the least common multiple of the denominators, and the least common multiple of those small denominators turns out is 42. So what we're going to do, we're going to be very careful here. We're not going to multiply by a full 42. In the numerator, I'm going to leave the 6 outside, because 42 is 6 times 7. I'm going to leave that 6 outside and just multiply through the parentheses by the 7. Meanwhile, in the denominator, with the 42, I'm going to leave the 7 on the outside and just multiply through by the 6. And that will give us this. Well, of course, in the numerator now, we have a quadratic. We've learned from our previous videos how to factor that. We factor that. We cancel the common factor. And this is the simplest fraction that we can get. In summary, we can undo multiplication by a fraction by multiplying by the fraction's reciprocal. That is a very important shortcut. When we have multiple fractions added or subtracted, we can clear the fractions by multiplying by the least common multiple of all the denominators. And we can simplify a complex fraction by multiplying the numerator and the denominator of the big fraction by the least common multiple of all the denominators of the little fractions.